Hello. Today we finish Hamlet. By the end of Act 3, where we stopped last time, we saw that Hamlet is no longer in doubt about the ghost's reality or Claudius's guilt, and he has forced his mother Gertrude to confront her sexual betrayal and promise to stay away from the usurping husband, Claudius's bed. But Hamlet is himself no happier than he was at the start of the play. Still depressed, he regards revenge as a burden and would prefer to die himself and thereby escape the ordeal of his isolated consciousness in a world that he still regards as meaningless, a world where human life still seems to him what it had earlier seemed, nothing more than a quintessence of dust. Now, we hear echoes of this reductive nihilism in Hamlet when he refers to disposing of Polonius's body as, quote, lugging the guts. Well, when Claudius finds out and asks Hamlet where he has hidden Polonius's corpse, consider Hamlet's response to that question. Hamlet, where's Polonius? At supper. At supper where? To which Hamlet replies, not where he eats, but where it is eaten. A certain convocation of politic worms are even at him now. Your worm is your only emperor for diet. We fat all creatures else to fat us, and we fat ourselves for maggots. Your fat king and your lean beggar is but variable service, 2 dishes, but to 1 table. That's an end, at which one has nothing but to show how a king may go in progress through the guts of a beggar. Now, Hamlet is still feigning insanity here, but his words betray his deep sense that life may well be pointless. It seems we are born to die, to be eaten by worms, which in turn are eaten by other animals that human beings then eat in an endless and pointless cycle of consumption that reduces a lean beggar and a fat king to the same absurd level. Death renders life pointless, and all social distinctions that we make above ground are completely obliterated by death. Thus, a beggar might eat a fish that ate a worm that ate the body of a king. So, as Hamlet says, in a grotesque inversion of rank, the beggar will eventually shit the remains of the king who has passed through his body. Now, when Gertrude speaks to Claudius after her traumatic conversation with Hamlet, she follows her son's instructions. She insists that Hamlet really is mad, as he told her to tell Claudius. But this, we know, is something that Claudius has already begun very much to doubt. And in their conversation, thus, we find that the queen says, he is mad as the sea and wind when both contend, which is the mightier. In his lawless fit, behind the arras, hearing something stir, whips out his rapier, cries a rat, and in this brannish apprehension kills the unseen good old man. Now, just as Gertrude is hiding the truth from Claudius here, among other things, the truth that Hamlet thought he was killing him, so too Claudius is hiding a truth from Gertrude. He doesn't tell her that he is planning to have Hamlet killed in England, but rather that he is sending her son abroad for 2 reasons. First, to protect the country because, quote, his liberty is full of threats to all, but also for Hamlet's own protection, he tells his wife. Rather than punishing him or leaving him vulnerable to prosecution, it's best for his sake that they get him out of the country. But we will ship him hence. In this vile deed we must, with all our majesty and skill, both countenance and excuse. Okay, this is his way, he seems, of excusing it. Thus, as he lies about his real intentions in sending Hamlet away to die, Gertrude also is after lying about the knowledge that Hamlet is merely feigning insanity, and that he, in fact, thought he was killing Claudius when he stabbed behind the arras. Now, Claudius knows that Gertrude loves her troubled son, and the fact that he now lies to her, to his lover, his wife, and his partner in crime about Hamlet indicates Claudius's fear of Hamlet and what Hamlet can do. Claudius expresses this fear and his intention to have Hamlet killed in private, in a brief soliloquy. in which we learn, as he stands alone, speaking to himself, "For everything is sealed and done, that else leans on the affair," and then sends Hamlet away. Then to himself, "And England, if my love thou hold'st at aught, as my great power thereof may give thee sense, since yet thy Cicerons looks rich and red after Danish sword, and thy free awe pays homage to us, thou mayst not coldly set our sovereign process, which imports it full, by letters construing to that effect the present death of Hamlet. Do it, England, for like the hectic in my blood he rages, and thou must cure me." Now, note that Hamlet's own soliloquy that follows, his sixth and final, comes in Act 4 shortly before he must leave for England. Standing in a Danish plain, he sees young Fortinbras of Norway crossing Denmark, with Claudius's permission, on his way to fight the Poles. These two nations are fighting over a tiny, seemingly valueless bit of no man's land, what the Norwegian captain calls a little patch of ground. Hamlet sees in this absurd struggle a kind of horrible futility, and sees in it the pointlessness of war, a conflict that he predicts will cost the lives of, quote, 2,000 souls and 20,000 ducats. Now, Hamlet's observation here is often read as Shakespeare's own denunciation of all war. But the chance encounter here with Fortinbras moves Hamlet in a different direction. Seeing how men kill each other for so little, Hamlet berates himself for still not having slain Claudius, who is about to send him away, because, as Claudius admits, there is a sense of Hamlet roiling in his blood. He can't get him off his mind. Well, Hamlet reminds himself that he has now a compelling reason to kill Claudius, one that has been sanctioned not just by the dead ghost of his father, but also by justice and even, it seems, by God. Now, Hamlet blames himself that Claudius is still alive, but do we blame him? Well, not when we recall that he did, after all, act when he believed that he was killing the king, whom he called a rat, only to find that it was Polonius. It's not as if he didn't act then. Now, being sent off to England, the fact is that he laments the fact that Claudius still lives and blames himself, but it is, after all, not the result of cowardly delay, but rather of exigent circumstances. Well, in his final soliloquy, Hamlet begins by acknowledging, as he puts it, that all occasions, all circumstance seem to have conspired against him, seem to have in some way prevented the murder, the killing that he feels he must undertake. He tells himself at first it is therefore not his fault that Claudius still lives. But then again, in these inner conversations that are always arguments with himself, once again, he then tortures himself with accusations of cowardly delay. As in this final soliloquy, he struggles to understand why he has not done the deed. "How all occasions do inform against me, and spur my dull revenge. Now, whether it be bestial oblivion, or some craven scruple, or thinking too precisely on the event, a thought which quartered hath but one part wisdom, and ever 3 parts coward, I do not know. Why yet I live to say, the thing is yet to do. Sir, if I have a cause, and will, and strength, and means, do." Why? Why is he still alive? And again he asks himself, "How stand I then, that I have a father killed, a mother stained, excitements of my reason and my blood, and yet all sleep, while to my shame I see the imminent death of 20,000 men, then that for a fantasy and trick of fame go to their graves like beds, fight for a little plot of land, whereon the numbers cannot try the cause, which is not tomb enough and continent to hide the slain. Oh, from this time forth my thoughts be bloody, or nothing worth. Now, here as earlier, Hamlet is both berating himself for not having killed Claudius and trying to spur him on to kill him by humiliating himself, mocking himself for his inaction, comparing himself to those soldiers he sees who have passed through the field on their way to Poland, who are about to kill and die for so much less than is at stake for him. He vows now that all his thoughts will be bloody. But there's, of course, a practical problem at this point. How will he find occasion to kill Claudius if he is now being shipped away? Well, after spending so much time in Hamlet's company and sharing his mental perspective with such intensity, we now, after this soliloquy, feel his absence on stage acutely. The sea journey will have, however, a transformative effect on Hamlet when he returns at the start of Act 5. But for the last 3 scenes in Act 4, Hamlet is out of Denmark and off stage. In his absence, the most compelling figure is Ophelia, who we discover has been driven to insanity by a combination of her father's death, Hamlet's role in it, and his earlier cruelty and insults toward her. When a courtier tells Gertrude of Ophelia's mental breakdown, Gertrude first declares, quote, "I will not speak with her." Why would she be so resistant? Well, probably because Gertrude feels partly responsible for the death of Polonius that has plunged Ophelia into madness. After all, she knew Polonius was eavesdropping behind the arras, and she knows that Polonius was killed because Hamlet was trying to avenge his father's death and her infidelity. In an aside to herself, Gertrude refers to her own sick soul, in which, quote, "guilt spills itself in fearing to be spilt." She feels she's betraying her guilt at times, even when she tries to hide it, but it is gnawing inside her. Now, she's tried to contain that guilt, but after Hamlet has forced her to see it in the mirror of his own denunciation, forced her to see what she calls the black and grained spots in her soul, after that, Gertrude can no longer suppress that guilt, which seems now to consume her and which she fears all will see. She knows that she must face the consequences of her sin. And so, after the reluctance to see Ophelia, knowing that it will cause her even more guilt, she says, let Ophelia come to her. Now, prior to Ophelia's arrival, Ophelia had been reported to be beating her breast, making weird winks and nods, and speaking things of but, quote, half sense. All right? Now, half sense is an apt phrase there, because as some of Hamlet's remarks in his feigned madness revealed, real or feigned madness can sometimes contain truth. So, as we'll see, there are moments of painful sense-making in Ophelia's genuine mental breakdown. When she enters the stage, she is singing about the 2 primary causes of her madness: her father's death and Hamlet's cruel, insulting behavior. She is devastated not by the fact that Polonius died so abruptly, but by the unceremonious disappearance of his body and the hasty burial thereafter. Thus, when she enters, she says, "He is dead and gone, lady, he is dead and gone. At his head a grass-green turf, at his heels a stone. White his shroud as the mountain snow." Now, note a little bit later, again, she sings of her father, "I cannot choose but weep to think they would lay him in the cold ground. Good night, ladies, good night, sweet ladies, good night, good night." Well, note that just as she laments this terrible loss, his burial obscurely in the cold ground, she also laments Hamlet's atrocious conduct toward her that has clearly also pushed her into madness, even as she laments that he betrayed her in some way through this conduct, telling her first that he loved her and then telling her that he did not, sexually insulting her. Now, she expresses this sense of injury in a lamentation, indirectly, but I think undeniably, when, quite against her modest virginal character, she sings another song, a dirty tune about a maid who is tricked and diverginated on Valentine's Day by the man she loved. The maid shows up at the man's window so as to be the first woman that he sees on Valentine's Day, hoping, according to legend and superstition, that seeing her first, he will then marry her, love her, and marry her. Thus, tomorrow is St. Valentine's Day, all in the morning betime, and I am made at your window to be your Valentine. Then up he rose and donned his clothes, and up the chamber door, let in the maid, that out a maid never departed more. Young men will do it, if they come to it, by cock they are to blame. Cock as in phallus. It is a ditty about a woman who thinks that she will win a man's love on Valentine's Day, and instead, when he lets her in, he steals her virginity and sends her away, and that's all. Now, we realize that Ophelia probably, like this woman in the song, hoped to marry Hamlet, despite her father and her brother's disapproval. The bawdiness of this song would have made the virginal Ophelia of the past blush, but her mind now seems to have been infected and unbalanced by Hamlet's own crass lewdness. Claudius, hearing her, says she is now, quote, divided from herself and her fair judgment. Now, that statement about Ophelia, she is divided from herself, touches, I think, on one of the many philosophical questions that Shakespeare raises in the play, and one of the most interesting. Divided from yourself raises the question, what is the self? If one can be divided from it, if one can lose a sense of self, what is the self to begin with? Is there such a thing that we can define? You remember earlier, Polonius had said rather fatuously to Laertes, to thy own self be true. But that's superficial advice because, of course, as we've seen, the self is so often mysterious in this play, often for Hamlet so difficult to pin down. We've seen how Hamlet struggles to know himself, constantly questioning who and what he is, and more broadly, what it means to be a human being. Well, Claudius describes Ophelia's insanity also as a poison of the mind. But he also fears, taking up that same trope of poison, that the people are now poisoning Laertes' mind, since he has returned from Paris, with rumors about Polonius' death. That is, poisoning, Claudius says, Laertes' mind with rumors that he, Claudius, killed his father. Thus the language of poison, Polonius says, looking at Ophelia. Oh, this is the poison of deep grief. It springs all from her father's death. And now, behold, O Gertrude, Gertrude, when sorrows come, they come not single spies, but in battalions. And looking at her, he thinks, oh, poor Ophelia, divided from herself, without the which we are pictures or mere beasts, if we don't know ourselves. If we're mad, we're no better than a beast. Last, and as much containing as all these, her brother is in secret now come from France, and feeds on his wonder, keeps himself in clouds, and wants not buzzers to infect his ear with pestilent speeches of his father's death. Now, there have been lots of buzzings in his ear, lots of rumors from the people that Claudius is responsible for Polonius' death. Now, both of the poisons that Claudius refers to here, the poison of Ophelia's madness and the poisonous rumors that are circulating in Denmark, both of those, after all, are outgrowths of the poison that Claudius originated when he literally poured poison in the ear of his sleeping brother in his orchard. From that act of killing and poisoning, all other forms of poison and attendant corruption sprang until all of Denmark is cankered, literally and figuratively, by what Hamlet called, quote, things rank and gross in nature. There's physical poison, and there is a kind of moral poison in the country. Now, despite Claudius's efforts at controlling the spread of this poison and corruption, the fact is that the country has already been contaminated, like the body of the dead king and like the soul of Claudius himself. There can be no purification, it would seem, until the murderer Claudius dies. The lies that Claudius continues to tell, of course, are more poison, and he continues to pour that poison now, the poison of lies, in the ears of others, including Gertrude, when, as we saw, he told her that he was sending Hamlet away partly for Hamlet's own protection. Now, one manifestation of Denmark's corruption, which, as I've noted, always reflects the state of the king, is the anarchy which seems to be rising in the streets following Polonius's death and hasty burial, and following Hamlet's strange departure. Remember, the people love Hamlet. A few weeks pass, it seems, between Polonius's death and Laertes' secret return from Paris. He has come back to Denmark to investigate the cause of his father's death and to punish the killer. Now, a messenger reports that, quote, "The rabble now call him Lord and cry, 'We choose Laertes shall be our king.'" Well, think of this. No sooner has Claudius dispatched Hamlet than he finds in Laertes another younger threat to his own political power. But Claudius finesses this danger brilliantly in dealing with the angry, impetuous Laertes, who is, of course, ready to blame him with his father's death. Claudius wisely waits until Gertrude has left the room to tell Laertes that Hamlet, not he, killed his father. Note at this point that although Hamlet and Laertes are constructed as antagonists, they are akin in one important way. They're alike in their drive to avenge the killer of their fathers. But there's a striking difference between them also. Whereas Hamlet has had to disguise his intentions to kill Claudius, Laertes rushes headlong into the palace, ready to attack Claudius for his father's death and his assumption, largely based on what the people have said, that Claudius did it. Well, Claudius, under these circumstances, under this pressure, handles Laertes' aggression with extraordinary tact and restraint, speaking to him calmly and hearing him out as he bursts onto the scene. The king says, "What is the cause, Laertes, that thy rebellion looks so giant-like? Let him go, Gertrude." She's trying to hold him back. "Do not fear our person. There's such divinity doth hedge a king that treason can but peep to what it would, little acts of will. God will protect me, because of course I'm innocent," he says. "Tell me, Laertes, why art thou thus incensed? Let go of him, Gertrude. Speak, man. Where is my father?" "Dead." But the queen says, "Not by him." The king says, let him demand his fill. Let us listen to him. To this point I stand, that both the worlds I give to negligence. Let come what comes. Only, says Laertes, I'll be revenged most thoroughly for my father. That's what I've come to say. Okay. Now, Laertes is enraged not just at his father's untimely death, but also at the undignified rush to bury Polonius that followed in its wake, which seems to have been a failed attempt to hide that death from the public, lest the public be suspicious and stirred up. Well, it hasn't worked to keep them calm. Laertes sees that hasty burial of a distinguished courtier as an insult to his father's memory, and he immediately blames Claudius for this when he charges, "Do you see this, O God? If by direct or by collateral hand they find us touched, we will our kingdom give, our crown, our life," says Claudius. "Yes, we will look into this." To which Laertes says, "His means of death, his obscure funeral, no trophy, sword, nor hatchment o'er his bones, no noble rite nor formal ostentation, cry to be heard, as 'twere from heaven or earth, that I must call into question." Yes. It's the insult, not just the death itself. Now, note that rather than responding defensively to these accusations, to these charges, because he does charge Claudius with failing to honor his father, instead of responding defensively to them, Claudius simply tells Laertes at first, quote, "I am guiltless of your father's death." It's only when they're in private, only when Gertrude has left, that he tells Laertes that Hamlet was his father's killer, though he does not mention the circumstances. Now, understandably, Laertes wants to know why Claudius didn't arrest Hamlet for the crime and instead has sent him away. Well, there are two reasons for this that Claudius lays out. The queen, his mother, he tells Laertes, lives almost by his looks, and for myself, my virtue or my plague, be it either which, she is so conjunctive to my life and soul, that as the star moves not, but in the sphere, I could not but by her. The other motive, why to a public count I might not go, is the great love the general gender bear him, that my arrows too slightly timbered for so loud a wind would have reverted to my bow again, and not where I had aimed them. Yes, if I had tried to prosecute him, it would have rebounded on me like an arrow shot out that comes back. Now note, although we've seen that Claudius very often lies in public, both of the reasons that he states here for sending Hamlet away are true. First, apprehending Hamlet, bringing Hamlet to justice, would injure Gertrude, who he says he cannot bear to injure. She's conjunctive to his life. And second, doing that would stir up a civil revolt among the people who love Hamlet. Now, Claudius is also accurate in telling Laertes, quote, he who hath your noble father slain also pursued my life. The dishonesty in his conversation with Laertes lies not in what he says, but rather in what he leaves out, what he omits, specifically his intention to have Hamlet killed in England because he's afraid that Hamlet will expose or try to avenge his own murder of King Hamlet. That he suppresses. Now, knowing that Polonius died by Hamlet's sword, not Claudius's, drives Laertes' desire to kill Hamlet. But he finds another motivation to bloody revenge against Hamlet when he sees something else, when he sees what Polonius's death has done to his sister Ophelia. When he learns that Hamlet was the killer of Polonius, he blames Ophelia's insanity on the prince as well. He's shocked when Ophelia enters, distracted and carrying flowers and herbs with her as she sings. There's rosemary. There's for remembrance. Pray you, love, remember. And there is pansies, and that's for thoughts. To which Laertes says, a documented madness, thoughts and remembrance fitted. Ophelia goes on. That's fennel for you and columbines. There's rue for you, and here's some for me. I would give you some violets, but they withered all when my father died. Now, you'll note here that at this point, much to Claudius's astonishment and dismay, he sees his sister in a complete state of derangement. By heaven, thy madness shall be paid with weight till our scale turn beam. O rose of maid, dear maid, kind sister, sweet Ophelia, O heavens, is it possible a young maid's wits should be as mortal as an old man's life? He's devastated by this, and his aggression against Hamlet is intensified. But at this very point, much to Claudius's astonishment and dismay, a message arrives from Hamlet. The note indicates that Hamlet is not dead, but very much alive, and that he has landed, quote, naked, that is, destitute and alone, back on the shores of Denmark. Now, this is definitely not the news that Claudius had expected, and it's certainly not the news he wants. Later, Hamlet tells Horatio the story of how his return to Denmark came about. Suspecting that Claudius planned to have him killed, suspecting rightly, in England, Hamlet explains that he stealthily stole the letters that were ordering his head be struck off by the English and forged a new letter to replace them. That letter allegedly from Claudius. In the forged letter, he orders the English ruler to assassinate not him, but the carriers of that letter that he has forged, those carriers being Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Hamlet puts the forged directive in the packet carried by his two spies, Claudius's two spies, and then before he has put it in there, he anoints it with the official seal of the king to make that letter that he has forged seem completely authentic. He explains this to Horatio when Horatio says, well, how was the letter sealed? How did you authenticate it to make it look like a plausible missive from Claudius? To which Hamlet says, why, even in that was heaven ordinate. I had my father's signet in my purse, which was the model of the Danish seal. Folded the writ up in the form of the other, subscribed it, gave it that impression, placed it safely. The changeling was never known. Now think about this for a moment. Note here that in explaining how he happened to have the signet ring, a signet ring of Denmark, of the crown, having that, Hamlet is convinced that God arranged for him to be able to validate the forged letter with the king's stamp so as to make it convincing. And in this detail, the normally uncertain, circumspect Hamlet sees the hand of God, what he calls heaven's ordinate, God's ordaining this. Hamlet believes that God wanted him to save his own life, wanted him to subvert Claudius's plot, wanted him to destroy Rosencrantz and Guildenstern instead, so that he can eventually avenge his father by killing Claudius. Indeed, Hamlet tells Horatio that he discovered God's intention for him while he was at sea, not just in the fact that he had this signet ring, but in everything that happened to him while he was away. As he eloquently expresses it to Horatio, there's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them, the how we will. To paraphrase, we may not be able to see our ends that God has ordained for us. We may be roughly confused about what he has planned for our lives, as Hamlet has been up until now, before the journey, but he's convinced that there is a plan. There is a divinity that shapes our ends, a destiny engendered by God. Now, at this point, Hamlet feels that there is a plan. This man, who had earlier seemed uncertain about God's justice and even about God's existence, no longer. A transformation has taken place in Hamlet. It took place while he was off stage in Act 4, while he was at sea. And this declaration to Horatio on his return marks Hamlet's moment of supreme recognition, a recognition of the metaphysical and a recognition of his own destiny, of who he is and what he's meant to be. Now, Hamlet's transcendental discovery of God's purpose could only occur outside the prison of Denmark, and the discovery has also freed Hamlet from the prison of his own mental isolation. He now senses something absolute beyond him. He senses the presence of the ultimate other, God. He's no longer tormented by his churning thoughts, by his bad dreams, and as a result, Hamlet, who returns in Act 5, no longer needs to speak to himself in soliloquy, as he had done in 6 soliloquies in the first 4 acts of the play. Those interior monologues were symptomatic, not just of Hamlet's doubts about everything, but also of his morbid solitude, of his inability to communicate with anyone else but himself. No longer. Now, Hamlet's sense of a providential design shaping his life seems to have grown even stronger when the pirates stopped and boarded the England-bound ship. Their intervention enabled Hamlet to escape and to find his way back to Denmark. From Hamlet's perspective, the arrival of these pirates, who treated him well, wasn't just coincidence. No, it was God's plan. In announcing his imminent arrival at Elsinore, in his note to Claudius, Hamlet calls his uncle, quote, high and mighty, flattering Claudius, and thereby putting Claudius immediately off guard. What's going on here? Claudius has no idea why Hamlet is still alive, nor why he is now taking what sounds like a conciliatory tone. But he is even more trustful of Hamlet now than he was before Hamlet left. So Claudius proposes to use Laertes as a means to kill Hamlet, since the assassination plot in England didn't work. And he proposes the killing of Hamlet through Laertes, both for Laertes' sake and for his own. Like a master strategist, Claudius simultaneously stokes Laertes' rage against Hamlet for Polonius's death and Ophiu's insanity, and at the same time, he convinces Laertes to be patient and to choose the right occasion to take his revenge. On the one hand, he says, there lives within the very flame of love a kind of wick or snuff that will abate it. That we should do when we would, for this would changes. Hamlet comes back. What would you undertake to show yourself indeed your father's son more than in words? Challenging him to avenge his father in more than in words. Do it in deeds. To which Laertes impetuously says, to cut his throat in church. But now Claudius says, yes, but patience. No place indeed should murder sanctuarize. Revenge should have no bounds. But, good Laertes, will you do this? Keep close within your chamber. Hamlet returned, shall know you are come home. Will put on those whose praise your excellence, and set a double varnish on your fame, the Frenchman gave you, bring you in fine altogether, and wager on your heads. He, being remiss, most generous, and free from all contriving, will not peruse the foils, so that with ease, or with a little shuffling, you may choose a sword unbaited, that is, one that does not have a blunt on the tip, and in passive practice requite him for your father. Yes, let's find the right opportunity by arranging a fencing match. Claudius proposes a scheme that he sees will surely lead to Hamlet's death. Laertes, according to this plan, is to challenge Hamlet to a fencing match because Claudius knows that his nephew takes pride in his skill and was envious when he heard reports of Laertes' reputation as a famous fencer in Paris. Now, while Hamlet's rapier, according to this plan, will have a blunt point, Laertes will not. Thereby, Hamlet, Claudius says, won't suspect there is a difference because he is so good-natured. This seems an odd concession and a wrong-headed one, perhaps, on Claudius's part. But in any event, because only Laertes' foil will be sharp-tipped, Laertes can then run Hamlet through under the guise of merely practicing in a fencing match. But then, as insurance, Laertes suggests poisoning the tip of his rapier, just in case when he stabs Hamlet, he only wounds him. Again, with that image that he suggests, we find the pervasive trope of poison, which is now presented both as a literal substance, the poison on the tip of the foil, but also again as a mode of deception. Hamlet will not know that my foil has a sharp poison tip. Within the play, we've seen both of these modes of poison, literal poison and the poison of lies, originated with Claudius and now have spread to others in various ways, including Laertes. Hamlet knows, as Claudius knows, that Hamlet is a skilled fencer. So he proposes now a third safeguard. They'll also poison Hamlet's drink, his wine, during the match. Claudius will go even further, he says, by putting a pearl in the goblet and telling Hamlet that he can have the gem when he drinks during the match. Finally, as if this were not enough, in order to induce Hamlet to compete, to make sure that he doesn't say, no, I don't think I'd rather participate, in order to induce him to compete, Claudius places a bet on Hamlet. He wagers that Laertes cannot touch him 3 times during their exhibition, this skirmish. Now, as Claudius elaborates this plot to kill Hamlet, we recognize not just how desperate he is to see Hamlet dead and silent, but also how much he respects Hamlet as a formidable enemy. Now, in laying out this plan, Claudius emphasizes that although Laertes will get his just revenge, no one will hold him responsible for the killing. Even Gertrude, quote, will call it an accident, Claudius says. Now, again, that's a crucial word, because the question of accident, what is accidental, hangs over Act 5. Why do things happen? Is it by chance, or is there some higher purpose and design? Well, Hamlet seems convinced of the higher purpose and design. He's convinced that the pirates raided the ship he was on because God ordained it, not by chance or accident. But there's a more ambiguous question of the accidental concerning Ophelia. Is her drowning an accident, or is it a deliberate suicide? Well, both Ophelia's madness and her death are, as I noted earlier, as she comes on stage, presented in the language of flowers that she carries. And this vegetation expresses more than Ophelia could sensibly express or explain in her state of derangement. When Laertes saw her carrying these plants that she had picked, he said that he was as devastated by her display of real madness as we saw Ophelia was by Hamlet's display of feigned madness. Each of these flowers or herbs that she carries and names and distributes has a traditional symbolic meaning that an Elizabethan audience would have known. The herb rosemary, which she first distributes, you recall, as she comes in, is associated with, quote, remembrance. Now, the word remember has reverberated through the entire play. The ghost tells Hamlet to remember his words. Hamlet tells Gertrude to remember her sin. At the end of the play, Hamlet will ask that Horatio remember him. But consider here that what Ophelia wants Laertes to remember is not specified. What is it that she wants not just Laertes, but Claudius and perhaps Gertrude, who were also present, to remember? Possibly her dead father, who was seemingly forgotten in that he was buried so obscurely and so hastily, but perhaps also when she says, here's rosemary for remembrance, she wants them to remember what she once was, the young woman she had been when her father was alive and when she still believed in Hamlet's love for her. Because, as Claudius has said, she is divided from herself, and Ophelia seems to realize that. Ophelia also distributes another herb called rue, and the name itself identifies it as a symbol of Ophelia's own rue. Rue means regret. It is a symbol of her regret, of her deep sadness. And she ends by mentioning violets. Violets are a traditional symbol of fidelity, of faithlessness. But of course, her father's death and Hamlet's cruelty and casting her off have robbed Ophelia of her faith in everything. Thus, she says, she has no violets. I would give you violets, but they all withered when my father died. Now, Ophelia, we learn, dies herself when she is near a river gathering more flowers and herbs. We don't see it, but Gertrude reports what she has heard from a messenger about Ophelia's demise. Ophelia, we're told, had made a coronet, a wreath, around her head with these plants she was picking, and as she was reaching out for them, she fell into the water and floated down the stream, finally drowning as the weight of her wet gown pulled her down. Thus, we are told, when Laertes says, "Drowned, oh where?" Gertrude says, "There is a willow grows askant the brook, that shows his hoar leaves in the glassy stream. Therewith fantastic garlands did she make of cornflowers, nettles, daisies, and long purples, that liberal shepherdesses give a grosser name, but our cold maids do dead men's fingers call them. There on the pendant boughs her crown, her coronet weeds, clamoring to hang, an envious silver broke, when down her weedy trophies and herself fell in the weeping brook. Her clothes spread wide and mermaid-like, a while they bore her up, which time She chanted snatches of old lauds, of the kind we've heard from her, as one incapable of her own distress, or like a creature native and endued unto the element. But long it could not be, till that her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to muddy death. Now, 250 years after Hamlet was written, Victorian artists in the 19th century were so fascinated by this scene as Gertrude has described it, the scene of Ophelia's drowning, that several prominent painters, particularly in the Pre-Raphaelite school, painted it, and it became one of the famous commonplace scenes in Victorian art. The most famous of them all was by Millet, and I've attached it as a link connection to this lecture. Have a look at it, but you will find there are several others. Now, before her drowning, Ophelia seems to be drowning in her own sorrow, in her own tears. As Laertes says, "Too much water hast thou, poor Ophelia." But was her death an accident, or was it a kind of passive suicide? Well, it's ambiguous, because it comes to us only in the second-hand report from Gertrude, who heard it from another. Now, on the one hand, Ophelia seems to have fallen rather than jumped from the cliff overlooking the stream, and she was so deranged as to be unaware of the danger of her situation as she drifted downstream singing to herself. That would suggest it was an accident. But on the other hand, Ophelia was depressed and grief-stricken to the point of derangement, so that perhaps she didn't want to resist the downward pull of her sodden garments as she floated, sinking further and further down until she was under the water. Now, this question of Ophelia's intention proves to be a major concern in Act 5 when that act opens. The two grave diggers are preparing Ophelia's grave and discussing the unusual conditions of her internment following an inquest by a coroner and widespread rumors that, quote, her death was doubtful. One of the grave diggers asks how it is that, quote, she is to be buried in a Christian burial when she willfully seeks her own salvation. That is, if she committed suicide, as many think, why should she be buried in Christian ground? Now, why should she then, he asks, be interred in a church cemetery if she took her own life? Bear in mind that a suicide always dies unconfessed and therefore dies in a state of mortal sin. And as a result, the church forbade both the burial of suicides on ecclesiastical ground and also denied them the usual religious ceremonies of a Christian funeral for those who have killed themselves. Now, although Ophelia has been granted this Christian burial, it's being done clandestinely because, of course, of the rumors that she took her own life and what would be perhaps a popular protest against the idea, therefore, of any kind of church burial on sanctified ground. Thus, the reference by the gravediggers to, quote, these maimed rites of her simple and very hasty burial, one that recalls the simple and hasty and obscure burial also of her father. The gravediggers attribute the fact that Ophelia is being interred in the churchyard at all to political influence. One of them says, quote, if she had not been a gentlewoman, that is, if she'd not been well connected at court, she would never be buried in this grave that we're digging for her. But even political influence can only go so far. While the church under pressure is permitting Ophelia to lie in holy ground, they have refused her the full funeral liturgy that would go with it because they suspect she has taken her own life. Well, following Polonius's undignified burial, this lack of ceremony incenses Laertes still more, and he rails at the church official who is requiring this extremely secretive and undignified interment. Laertes says, must no more then be done for her? To which the official says, "No more be done. We should profane the service of the dead to sing a requiem and such rest to her as to peace-parted souls." Now, clearly, just a few prayers at the grave are going to be all she gets. To which Laertes says, "Lay her in the earth, and from her fair and unpolluted flesh may violets spring. I tell thee, churlish priest, a ministering angel shall my sister be when thou liest howling in hell." Yes, she will be favored by God because she's pure and innocent. She should be given the full rights of the Christian liturgy here for her fair, unpolluted flesh. Notice he mentions violets here that will spring from her grave, the very thing that Ophelia had said she did not have since her father's death, because they are a symbol of faith and fidelity. Well, Laertes shows his faith and fidelity here in his sister's virtue when he imagines that they will spring from her obscure tomb. Now, in remembrance of Ophelia, Gertrude scatters flowers on the gravesite, using the same language of flowers, if you will, to honor Ophelia that Ophelia had used in her madness. And Gertrude says, "I hoped thou shouldst have been my Hamlet's wife." Now this is the first we've heard of that intention, but we suspect that Gertrude's hope that Hamlet and Ophelia would wed dates from the time when King Hamlet was still alive, and certainly before Hamlet's fall into melancholy. Well, as the gravediggers shovel the earth, one of them throws up the skulls of previously deceased bodies. Now, it was the practice in Shakespeare's time to inter the dead in the same area where many other corpses had been buried. And the gravedigger jokes that with his friend that what he is building here with his spade as he digs is stronger, he says, than what a shipwright or a carpenter make, because, quote, "the houses I make last till doomsday." Now, what is he referring to? The house that the gravedigger is referring to isn't a coffin. He doesn't make the coffins. Rather, the house he's referring to is the hole he's digging where the body is to be buried. That hole, he says, will last till the end of the world. That's not the case, however, with coffins themselves, which are made of wood. They rot as the water seeps in to the ground and then into the wood. The gravedigger explains this process to Hamlet and explains how the bodies themselves inside the wooden coffin similarly decay. This entire scene, particularly after Hamlet enters it, is full of graveyard humor, as skull after skull is tossed up from the pit that is being dug by these chatty gravediggers. Now, it's notable, of course, that in death, all of these skulls look very much the same. Whether the deceased was a politician or a lawyer or a pauper, you can scarcely tell from the way a grinning skull looks. When Hamlet enters with Horatio and sees this, he asks, quote, "Did these bones cost no more the breeding, but to play at lawgets with them? Mine ache to think on it." To paraphrase, Hamlet says, "I would hate to think that these lives that are now deceased were created for no other reason so that you gravediggers could toss the bones out as you are digging a grave as if those bones were pieces of a game, lawgets." Now, the Hamlet we saw before his transformative journey might have embraced the idea then that life was absurd and that there was really no more point to living than to dying and then having your bones tossed up as if they were game pieces. But the Hamlet who now jokes about death with the gravedigger has clearly changed. He has discovered, as I've noted, that there is a divine purpose in creation that seems to give value and meaning to what we do. Now, there are hints of that pattern that Hamlet believes in the world and that reflect God's design, but Hamlet couldn't see them before, and now he doesn't see them completely, but he believes in the design itself. And there are hints of that design, for example, in this scene, when Hamlet asks how long the gravedigger has been at his job. Consider the gravedigger's response. Hamlet says, "How long hast thou been a gravemaker?" To which he says, "Of all the days in the year, I came to it the day that our last king Hamlet overcame Fortinbras." Hamlet says, "How long is that since?" To which the gravedigger says, "Cannot tell you that. Every fool cannot you tell that? Every fool can tell that. It was that very day that young Hamlet was born. Be that is mad, and is now sent to England." He doesn't recognize Hamlet. Hamlet says, "Ay, marry, why was he sent to England?" To which the gravedigger says, "Why, because he's a mad. I shall recover his wits there. Or, if it do not, 'tis no great matter." Ha ha! A play on matter as in gray matter, as in the brain. Now, note, the gravedigger explains that he began his profession the day that Hamlet was born, which also seems to have coincided with the exact day that King Hamlet defeated Fortinbras. Well, what is the implication then, or the coincidence of these three dates? He begins digging graves for the dead the day Hamlet is born, but it's also the day of another death, the death of Norway as killed by the glorious sword of his father. Well, one implication of these coincidental dates is that from the time of his birth, Hamlet was destined to meet this gravedigger, because this will be the day of his own death, as indeed it proves to be. We are all born to die. Yes, we are all born astride the grave. Hamlet knows this, and he has lamented this truth earlier in the play, but his tone and attitude now have changed as he contemplates and discusses death. He can now look directly at death in the most immediate way, at skulls and bones, and he can look at the physical manifestations of death without a desire to die himself, without fearful speculations about what follows death, and without a sense that the fact of death renders all human life and activity meaningless. All of those had been things that had tormented him earlier in his depressive state, but no longer. Earlier, Hamlet felt that we eat only so that we can ultimately be eaten by worms. But his attitude now, I think, is different. The thought of death, both personal and collective, no longer troubles him. Now, we see this change, I think, most fully when the gravedigger identifies one of the exhumed skulls as that of the jester Yorick, whom Hamlet loved as a child. The gravedigger seems to know that this is Yorick's skull, not because it looks different from the others, but because he knows, having been so long a gravedigger, where Yorick was buried. Hamlet takes the skull and looks at it. "Let me see. Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now how abhorred in my imagination is it. My gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips that I have kissed, I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table to a roar? Not one now to mock your own grinning, quite chapfallen. Now get you to my lady's chamber, and tell her, let her paint an inch thick of this favor, she must come. Make her laugh at that." Yes, you'd have to paint the skull an inch thick in order to make it look like the Yorick he remembered, who set the table roaring with laughter. Now, this meditation, as he looks at Yorick and smells the decay and addresses the dead jester, is a complex one. Contemplating the grinning skull, however, does not fill him with existential dread, but rather with a recollection of playing with Yorick as a child. And yes, that memory carries regret because Yorick is dead, but it also carries more forcibly with it the sense of love, of how he would hang upon Yorick's lips, of how he loved the way Yorick made others laugh. Thus, the emphasis is ultimately, I think, more on love here, that he is remembering, than on agonizing loss or regret. Hamlet's discovery of Providence also allows him to look beyond death, on the other side of death, without speculation and dismay. And we see this change when he jokes with Horatio that the process of bodily decay means that the remains of Alexander the Great might be used to plug a hole in a beer barrel. He says, Alexander was buried, Alexander returneth to dust. The dust is earth, of earth we make loam, and why of that loam whereto he was converted might they not to stop a beer barrel? Imperious Caesar, dead and turned to clay, might stop a hole to keep the wind away. Now, note here that, again, this might sound morbid, but unlike Hamlet's earlier remarks about an emperor passing through the guts of a beggar, his tone here is more playful and reflective than bitter and depressive. Hamlet asks at this moment, having mused on the fact that even the greatest and most famous of men, in their decay, might simply be used to patch a wall or a beer barrel, he then asks, whose grave is it you are digging? The gravedigger says only, quote, one that was a woman. Okay? It's only when Hamlet sees them bringing the coffin to be placed in the grave that he realizes that the grave is for Ophelia, the woman he loved and the woman he injured, the woman he cast off, whether for her own sake or for the perpetuation of his antic disposition or out of a inability to control his horror at female sexuality, all of which are possible. Now, we can only imagine at this moment the combination of guilt and grief that Hamlet must feel, but his behavior here becomes most peculiar, most puzzling. And I think in it we come now to a third mystifying moment in the play that one can speculate about, I think, but never adequately explain, though I will try. When Hamlet sees the distraught Laertes tell the gravedigger to, quote, hold off the earth till I have caught her once more in my arm, and when Hamlet then watches Laertes leap into the newly dug grave, open the coffin, and embrace the corpse of his sister, how does he react at this display of horrible, passionate grief on Laertes' part? His response is to challenge Laertes to a kind of competition of grief, thereby seeming to mock and diminish Laertes' own sorrow, and indeed causing Laertes to try at this moment to throttle him. Hamlet says, when Laertes is forced to part from him, Hamlet says, why, I will fight with him upon this theme of grief until my eyelids will no longer wag. I loved Ophelia, Hamlet says. 40,000 brothers could not with all their quality of love make up my sum. What wilt thou do for her? Swound, show me what thou do. Whoa, you'll weep? What? Wilt fight? Fast? Wilt tear thyself? What, drink up an easel? Eat a crocodile? Do it. Dost thou come here to whine, to outface me with leaping in her grave? Be buried quick with her, so will I. Nay, and thou mouth I'll rant as well as thou wilt. To which Gertrude says, oh, this is mere madness. This is madness. And who's to say at this moment that it isn't another momentary lapse into madness? Well, how do we explain this? What is going on? This behavior seems a deeply insensitive way to treat a grieving man whose sister and father have just died as a result of Hamlet's own actions. What causes this erratic conduct? Well, Gertrude claims it's a moment of genuine madness, and when Hamlet later apologizes for his conduct to Laertes, he too says that it was, quote, the insanity of a moment. Quote, Hamlet from himself was taken away. We're reminded by that phrase again what Claudius had said of Ophelia. She's divided from herself. We're reminded that we can lose a sense of who we are. And that statement from Hamlet, that Hamlet was from himself taken away, sounds like the old Hamlet, the pre-voyage Hamlet, not the one who has returned with a clear understanding of himself and his destiny, the Hamlet who knows who he is. Now, I would suggest that what we find here then is a kind of brief aberration. Hamlet knows himself well enough to recognize shortly thereafter that this brief outburst was a departure from the sanity that he has regained. But why did he behave that way to begin with and insist that his love for the dead girl was greater than that of the brother who is leaping into her grave to embrace her body one last time? Why did he do that? Was it to appear mad as he had done earlier as a form of self-protection? No, I don't think so. Hamlet now doesn't perpetuate his attic disposition any longer. And the Hamlet we see everywhere else in Act 5 is and behaves entirely sanely. I think, then, the closest we can come to a coherent explanation is the one that Hamlet hints at when he looks back on this event and describes his feelings to Horatio. He says, "But I am very sorry, good Horatio, that to Laertes I forgot myself. For by the image of my cause I see the portraiture of his. I'll court his favors, but sure the bravery of his grief did put me into a towering passion." Okay. Seeing Laertes enact the grief that Hamlet felt for his father and now feels for Ophelia, Hamlet, seeing that, identifies so fully and intensely with Laertes' grief that he momentarily loses his emotional self-control. That's what he means when he says, "I forgot myself." But I would suggest that while this may appear to be a momentary relapse into some kind of madness of the kind we saw earlier with Gertrude and with Ophelia, I don't think it really is madness. I think here the phrase "forgot myself" suggests that he has done something else. It indicates that Hamlet knows who he is and recognizes that in some ways it was simply a loss of emotional self-control. He suggests that his aggression against Laertes at the gravesite is rooted in the fact that Laertes could express his grief so openly and powerfully, whereas Hamlet has had to repress the depth of his anguish over his father's death even now. You remember earlier when he saw the players and Hecuba's speech, what's he to Hecuba or Hecuba to him that he should weep so, he feels in some way frustrated at his own inability to demonstrate in action the full measure of his mourning. Thus, when he looks at Laertes, who enacts his grief so dramatically, leaping into the grave, but also so naturally and openly, it's as if he feels jealous, and in response to that jealousy and frustration at his own earlier suppression of his feelings, tries to imitate Laertes' extreme behavior, as if by imitating it, by challenging him in this competition to grief, he is now discharging and exorcising all the pent-up grief that Hamlet felt for his father earlier and now feels for Ophelia, but was unable then to express. Now it comes out. Thus he says, "I'll rant as well as you." But afterward, in recognizing that he and Laertes have both lost their fathers and that they are both grieving Ophelia, Hamlet, as he explains to Horatio, has come to see Laertes as a kind of mirror, as a way of seeing himself and his own feelings more clearly. This is what he refers to when he calls his own grief, when he refers to his own grief as in portraiture of Laertes. I see a portrait of my own grief, but fully manifest and dramatized in Laertes' actions. It's as if he's a mirror for me, and it is a mirror that allows Hamlet now to release his own. Now, it is appropriate that Laertes and Hamlet will later fight with foils. Foils, of course, are fencing swords. But I say it's appropriate because Shakespeare plays on the concept of their characters as foils for one another throughout the play. And nowhere more so, I think, than in Act 5. In fact, as they are about to joust, Hamlet says to Laertes, "I'll be your foil, Laertes." Well, Laertes has been his foil. Laertes is certainly his foil at the grave scene. Insulted by Hamlet's bizarre behavior at this solemn occasion, at Ophelia's gravesite, Laertes, who already wants to kill Hamlet, is now ready to strangle him on the spot, and, impetuous as ever, attempts to do so. To which Hamlet replies as they grapple, "I prithee take thy fingers from my throat, for though I am not splenitive and rash, yet have I in me something dangerous, which let thy wisdom fear. Hold off thy hand." And a moment later, they pluck them asunder. What is Hamlet referring to when he says that he has something dangerous within him that Laertes should wisely fear? Is it the dangerous knowledge of Claudius's guilt? Well, how would that endanger Laertes? I don't think it's that. More likely, Hamlet is referring to his knowledge that God has appointed him to enact justice, and that Laertes could be a casualty of that justice within his divine plan if he cleaves to Claudius and if he isn't careful. Laertes seems to sense some kind of danger as he allows himself to be pulled away and releases his grip. But why, after this altercation, does Hamlet then agree to fence with Laertes? One would have thought that this would be the last thing he would want to do, to renew a kind of aggression which he tells Horatio he regrets. But instead he says, "Let the foils be brought, the gentleman willing, and the king hold his purpose. I will win for him, and I cannot, and I can. If not, I will gain nothing but my shame and the odd hits." He says the king's pleasure, yes, we'll fight. If his fitness speaks, mine is ready, now or whensoever, provided he be able as now, so able as now. Mine is ready. Now, the important word here is ready, which reverberates from this point forward. Hamlet knows that God's design is for him to kill Claudius in an act of divine justice, in some way and at some point. And he is now sure that he will kill him. But note that he undertakes the killing of Claudius, just as he undertakes this fencing match, without any sense of urgency or fear. He no longer anxiously torments himself because he hasn't yet killed Claudius. He doesn't blame himself, doesn't accuse himself of cowardice anymore. Hamlet knows that he will be ready when the assigned time comes, but the specific occasion is in God's hands to reveal to him. Here's how he explains his readiness to act in accordance with providential design when he explains it to Horatio. He says, "There is a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. Since no man of aught he leaves knows what is to leave betimes. Let be." Because everything that happens, Hamlet says, in life is overseen by a providential design, by an all-seeing creator. Because of that, there is pattern and purpose even in the fall of a sparrow. Nothing is merely accidental. Nothing is without God's intention. But we cannot know everything that God has planned for us from our limited earthly perspective. Still, Hamlet understands that despite what appears to be chaos in human life, there is an underlying order there. Man's task is to accept it and act in accordance with God's will rather than trying to force his own will onto the world. Thus, Hamlet concludes with the words, "let be." That is, let life take its course, let God's design reveal itself. Later, in the same spirit of acceptance, the dying Hamlet will use the phrase that the Beatles famously picked up, "let it be." He no longer needs now to watch Claudius anxiously, trying to plot a plan or a moment when to strike. He knows that moment will be revealed to him in all readiness. All that matters is the readiness to act in accordance with God's will at the moment that God provides. Hamlet is finally at peace because he realizes that the decision-making is out of his hands. And this is why he seems no longer to feel the revenge killing as he had up until now as a terrible burden that he must bear, as a dread obligation, as a curse that he feels he must make right. No. Hamlet also now has made peace with his other inner demons, not just his doubts about the value and purpose of human existence, and not just his doubts about the coherence of his own identity, but he seems also to have made peace with his preoccupation about his mother's sexuality. Now, when he sees Gertrude with Claudius, he's no longer wondering whether they have been in bed together. He's no longer railing against their incestuous union. He's also now, having returned from his sea voyage, he is moved past his earlier propensity for guilty brooding. Now, while Hamlet surely does feel guilty at the sight of Ophelia's coffined body, he doesn't flagellate himself for causing her death afterward. That, too, he can accept. Indeed, as he approaches the duel with Laertes, Hamlet is almost serene. And during the duel, Gertrude is so glad to see that serenity and so supportive and pleased at Hamlet's more relaxed bearing that she offers to wipe her son's sweaty forehead with her handkerchief. Unfortunately, Gertrude is rooting for Hamlet so hard that in celebration of Hamlet's 2 palpable hits on Laertes, she drinks from the poison cup that was meant for her son. Claudius sees this, and in aside, he says, "It's too late." Unlike Claudius, who has lived by deception since he killed the king and blamed it on a venomous snake, Laertes is immediately disgusted at his own dishonesty. Yes, he did propose poisoning the tip of the rapier, but now, as the duel is about to begin, he regrets that. It goes against his nature, which is forthright and honest for the most part. So as he prepares to strike Hamlet with the poisoned rapier tip, he says that such deceit, quote, "is almost against my conscience." Yes, even though I hate him and I charge him with my father's death and my sister's death, still. And when Laertes and Hamlet wound each other with the poisoned foil as they scuffle and one picks it up and then the other, as that's going on and Laertes realizes he's been stabbed, he says, "I am justly killed with my own treachery." This is what deceit brings. The poison of deceit is now appropriately punished by the poison tip of the rapier I prepared. Well, within 10 minutes of stage time, depending on the length of this duel, which can go on, as in the Kenneth Branagh version, for quite a long time, within, let us say, 10 minutes of stage time, 4 deaths occur on stage. These are violent deaths that would never appear on stage in Greek theater. Gertrude dies first, crying, the drink, I am poisoned." Laertes then dies of the poisonous wound he received in the scuffle. But first he confesses his deceit and asks Hamlet to, quote, "exchange forgiveness with me." That is, forgive me for taking your life, Hamlet, for wounding you with poison, and I'll forgive you for causing the deaths of my father and sister. Hamlet accepts. Laertes also makes a just accusation as he is expiring. Quote, the king's to blame, as indeed he is for everything that happens in this play. Claudius, in this specific instance, has used Laertes as an instrument in his attempt to kill Hamlet. But more broadly, of course, he's to blame for initiating the entire poisoning of Denmark from a single vial, driven by his ambition. Now, the spread of that poison now justly claims Claudius's own life. the third body on stage, when Hamlet stabs him with the same sharp poisoned rapier with which he and Laertes had wounded each other. Unlike Laertes, who admits his guilt before dying, Claudius, though we know he's consumed with guilt, does not. In the face of Laertes' accusation, the king's to blame, Claudius cries, "Defend me, friends, for I am hurt." He has no friends now to defend him. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are also dead, as Tom Stoppard announces in the title of his play. Just as he could not pray earlier, Claudius seems unable to pray for God's forgiveness even now as he is dying. The fourth and final body that loads the stage is, of course, Hamlet's own. As he's dying, he offers tantalizing words to Horatio about what caused his transformation, some of which we understand, but not all of it. And then he breaks off, leaving us full of wonder, as we are also left to wonder, full of wild surmise a moment later, when again the dying Hamlet breaks off and says, "The rest is silence." And he can tell us no more. Consider his valedictory words to Horatio. "Had I but time, as this fell Sergeant Death is strict in his arrest, oh, I could tell you, but let it be, Horatio. I am dead. Thou livest. Report me and my cause aright to the unsatisfied. If thou didst ever hold me in thy heart, absent thee from felicity a while, and in this harsh world draw thy breath in pain to tell my story." Let it be. Let it be enough that I have now fulfilled justice, that I have now fulfilled the demand of my Father, and that I have fulfilled the design of a higher power, of God. Nothing more is needed now, he says, except this. Hamlet asks Horatio to do essentially what the ghost had asked Hamlet to do. Remember this moment and remember me. And note that he makes this request without extenuation, without any contingencies, without anything other than a submission now to death as the fate that God has arranged for him. Let it be is, among other things, a surrender to God's will in the act of unbeing. And surely that phrase, let it be, echoes with the most famous lines in the play, to be or not to be. Now, the question is, as he is ceasing to be, will he resist it? No. Let it be. I accept this. I accept it. Now, Hamlet's charge to Horatio is, unlike the ghost's charge to him, not to go out and kill, but rather to tell his story. Why? Well, it would seem Hamlet wants his story told as a lesson in justice, but also as a lesson in spiritual discovery. And Horatio is ready to tell his story just moments after Hamlet expires. Just before he dies, Hamlet prophesies something. He prophesies, quote, "The election lights on Fortinbras." That is, he foresees the young man whom he had seen briefly crossing a field. He foresees that young man, that prince, who has been seeking to avenge the death of his own father, killed by King Hamlet, that man will ascend to the throne of Denmark. Things have come full circle. Now the son of the man who King Hamlet killed will become the ruler of the land that King Hamlet used to reign in. Fortinbras is about to become that ruler, but he doesn't yet know it when he enters in the play's final moments. He is crossing back through Denmark after defeating the Poles. Is it accidental that he's crossing there? Is it accidental that he comes at a time when the king is dead? No. Again, there's the sense of some kind of providential design in what otherwise might seem mere coincidence or accident. There are two eulogies pronounced on Hamlet at the play's end. First, Horatio commends the angels to take his friend to eternal rest, sure that Hamlet's soul will go to heaven, much as Laertes was sure that Ophelia's would. Then young Fortinbras, who is, like Horatio and Laertes, yet another male foil for Hamlet, offers another eulogy. He pays Hamlet the respect of a soldier. He says, "Let 4 captains bear Hamlet like a soldier to the stage, for he was likely, had he been put to have proved most royal, and for his passage the soldier's music and the right of war speak loudly for him." And then take up the bodies. Such a sight as this becomes the field, but here shows much amiss. You see bodies like this on a battlefield, but they shouldn't be here in a palace. But bear Hamlet away as you would with all the pomp and circumstance of a soldier. Now, we recall that King Hamlet's ghost was arrayed in armor, his warrior soldierly outfit, when he passed on the command to Hamlet to wage war against Claudius and to kill him. But the honor of a soldier's solemn funeral is more appropriate here than Fortinbras knows, because Hamlet has struggled valiantly not just against Claudius in their family war, but he has also for 4 acts struggled valiantly against himself. He has, in his own memorable phrase, been forced to, quote, take arms against a sea of troubles, those troubles within his own mind that he has braved. Now, before leaving the play, I want you to think, for the start of Friday's class, about Hamlet in relation to Aristotle's concept of a hamartia, that is, a fatal mistake that the tragic protagonist makes, which is often, but not always, according to Aristotle, caused by some inner flaw or imperfection. What is Hamlet's mistake? Well, you could argue that he made a mistake in not killing Claudius when Claudius seemed to be praying, and if he had dispatched him, then Claudius's soul would have gone to hell. But was killing him then really what God intended? It would seem not, based on what Hamlet suggests in Act 5. Also, Hamlet's failure to act then seemed not to derive from any flaw. It wasn't an expression of cowardice or self-deception. Now, it's curious that in Shakespeare's other tragedies, we find pretty clearly what we have come to call tragic flaws that lead to fatal mistakes. Those tragic flaws in otherwise noble characters are readily apparent. King Lear's vanity, Macbeth's ambition, Othello's jealousy and impatience, as we'll see. But such a central weakness is hard to find in Hamlet. Yes, you might say, well, he thinks too much and he thinks too deeply, but this would also be to identify his greatest strength as a character. And thus, it's difficult to find in him a flaw that contributes to a mistake. Now, I'm not suggesting that Hamlet is by any means perfect. No, he is far crueler to Ophelia than he needs to be, and his preoccupation with his mother's sex life seems so perverse and arguably incestuous or misogynistic, one or the other, or both, that it does tend to taint his character. But neither of those flaws contributes to his death or contributes to his undoing or his fall in any way. Which brings us to another difficult question vis-a-vis Aristotle. Unlike all other Shakespeare tragic heroes who fall from fortune into misfortune, Hamlet moves in the opposite direction. Hamlet seems to die somewhat triumphantly. It is tragic that he needs to die at all, but he has accomplished what he sought to do. He has fulfilled his father's command. He has enacted justice by surrendering to and enacting the will of God. And he's done so, it seems, without in any way morally tainting himself. Unlike Electra, I think, who most closely resembles him in this reverse pattern, Hamlet's revenge killing doesn't morally taint or degrade him. Rather, it seems, according to his description at least, that it is in some way sanctioned and even sanctified by God's intention. Well, as I said at the outset of our consideration of Hamlet, this is the most inexhaustible play ever read, ever written, and you can return to it a dozen times during the course of your life and find something new and fascinating and mysterious with each new reading or each new viewing.